So here's some feedback back on discussion board 8, and I'm going to try and answer some of the questions that you asked in this discussion board. First question from Zach, and this is about Berlusconi. Berlusconi was an Italian politician who used sports to run a campaign. Are there any examples of US politicians who use sports in their campaigns? I know Gerald Ford played football for Michigan, and I'm sure there are other examples of politicians who played sports. But did any follow the Berlusconi method? I don't think anybody actually went to the extent of doing what Berlusconi did. That was a total adoption of the notion of a football team and football as a metaphor for politics. As we've seen, there's lots of sports metaphors used by politicians, and obviously they use their particular celebrity as athletes to support their appeal as politicians. So obviously there's people like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the governor of California, Bill Bradley, of course, and that his name has already been mentioned. Jack Kemp, he was played in the AFL for 13 seasons. He was a vice presidential running mate of Bob Dole in the 90s, and also ran for president himself. And of course, Jesse Ventura, the wrestler, who was the governor of Minnesota. You might also think of not athletes, but sports team owners. I think I mentioned Thaksin Shinawatra, who was the owner of Manchester City. He was the Prime Minister of Thailand from 2001 to 2006. And of course, George W. Bush, who was the owner of the Texas Rangers. And all of them use that connection with sports to enhance their political appeal. Yanlin asks, it's often said that sports and politics are two aspects of society, taking Olympic Games in particular. How did it reflect the real world? I'm going to connect that question about the Olympic Games and politics to Josh's question. What impact has the presence of media played on politics and sport? I know it obviously has an effect, but do you think that political figures would use sport as much as they do if the presence of the media were not there? Well, clearly, big sporting events attract the media, they attract the attention of the world, and they are there to be manipulated by those who want to make a political statement. And so there's lots of examples of the Olympics being used to make political statements. Think of the 1936 Berlin Olympics, which was an attempt by Hitler to showcase how superior Aryan athletes were, and therefore to enhance his particular government of Germany. 1968 Mexico Olympics, that's when the two African American athletes made the Black Power salutes as a particular demonstration in 1968 of the importance of the civil rights struggle and what was going on then. 1972, of course, was the Munich Olympics, and that was the terrorist attack upon the Olympic Village and the holding of Israeli athletes and their massacre, holding them hostage and their subsequent massacre. And then the one that a friendlier and nicer manipulation of politics and sport was the one that you read about in the chapters from playing the Enemy, and which became the movie Invictus, in which Nelson Mandela used the Rugby World Cup to kind of really unite South Africa together as one nation. And that was essential, that the media was there covering that particular event, because everybody in that World Cup final was watching that game, black, white, coloureds, whatever the apartheid designations, everyone was supporting the Springboks, the national team. Kaylee says, in this week's lecture, we discussed English sports identity as viewed by both the English and by foreigners. How would you describe the United States in terms of sports? Do you think foreign opinion differs from domestic opinion? In what ways? Well, clearly it does. One of the ways that foreign opinion works, as we've said, is to stereotype the other, to create a stereotypical view of other cultures, which help define one's own culture. So clearly one of the things I would suggest is that American sports are often looked at in sense of awe and envy because of the resources that athletes have. So if you think of the Olympic Games, if you think of the kinds of athletes who compete in the Olympic Games, the United States has far greater resources to help those athletes than any other country in the world. So of course there's a certain amount of envy and admiration that American athletes do have that kind of support. Of course it varies from team to team. In terms of basketball, for example, clearly everybody in the world talks about and identifies the dream team as being far superior to any other basketball team. If you think of soccer, I think the prevailing view of the American team is that here's a team that never gives up. If you remember, if you saw the Team USA play Belgium in the last World Cup, that was an incredible display of amazing fortitude, of resistance, of never giving up. Tim Howard, of course, one of the greatest displays of a goalkeeper, and of course the fact that they kept trying and trying in that extra time. They forced extra time and came very close to winning that game. So there's a great admiration of the soccer team because of their ability to never give up, even though they don't have all the stars of other teams. Matt says, have there been any studies regarding critical discourse analysis in relationship to particular media outlets? For instance, is one network better than others when forming language describing race and sex, etc.? Critical discourse analysis is a kind of an approach to looking at the media which is very European, and it's less used in United States. Our discourse analysis is probably the media is probably the one particular focus of critical discourse analysis. There's lots and lots of work done on that, looking how the media represents particular points of view with regard to, for example, political situations. For example, strikes. A lot of work done by that in Europe. What we noticed in the earlier work on communications and the media, and the work done there looking at the biases that appear in commentary in terms of race and gender, that's very much an American approach. And you can begin to see differences in particular types of media with regard to those things. Often in terms of critical discourse analysis, it is related to the particular political stance that media takes. And that's more of a tradition in Europe, that media is more open in terms of their political affiliation. Newspapers, television networks are often characterized by their particular political view. And of course that's far more open and transparent than it is in the United States, where of course you do have certain networks reflecting certain political viewpoints, but it's usually not as marked as it is in Europe. John asks, how is our media building our national identity today? With everything that has been happening lately, with the shootings and terrible headlines, do you think our media is dividing us further with conflict, or maybe is it displaying the needed coverage and information to try and help change our own identity to become better people? Wow, that's a really difficult question. Hopefully there will be, in a sense, a conflict of opinion in the media, because that's the basis of democracy, that people have different views and they express those different views. What we tend to see is that there are certain general attitudes reflected in the media, and with the latest, of course, shootings in North Carolina, we've seen the media expressing outrage at the particular actions of the killer, to the extent of calling the particular person a terrorist. I don't know if we agree on that. There's lots of divisions there. I don't know if everybody agrees with the media, which tends to be thinking in terms of banning the flag, of the South, the old South, the Confederate flag. In all these situations, the media tends to be very strong on gun control, but what we've seen, of course, is that very little happens in terms of that. So the media does and does not have great influence on how we identify ourselves, but hopefully they present the possibilities, the ideas, the things we need to take into consideration. So thank you for those questions, and thank you for all the questions during this course.